The convoy moved slowly through the rocky desert terrain, a line of armored trucks grinding forward under the punishing heat. Kara sat in the commander's seat of her vehicle with the map open across her lap. The paper was already wrinkled and streaked with sweat from her fingertips. But she studied it with the patience of someone who knew order mattered in a place where chaos could appear without warning. The hum of engines filled the air, deep and steady, while every rattle and creak of gear seemed louder than it should have been. The soldiers around her tried to appear casual, but their shoulders betrayed them. Even through the armor of the vehicles, she could see how each man and woman kept glancing toward the ridgelines. Sunglasses hid their eyes, but not the sharp, nervous tilt of their heads. Machine gun barrels pointed out of turrets like wary eyes, sweeping from side to side as the convoy crawled forward. The road ahead stretched into waves of shimmering heat. The horizon blurred in a haze of dust. Kara adjusted her headset and listened to the low murmur of radio chatter. It came in short bursts, clipped reports and acknowledgments, all routine, yet every pause left a thread of unease behind. Static filled the gaps, crackling just enough to remind her that silence was not peace. She tapped the map with her finger, tracing their position, thinking about how much terrain remained between them and the next checkpoint. She had traveled stretches like this before, and the familiarity was not comforting. Too quiet was still too dangerous. On the left side of the road, a group of locals stood at a distance. They were motionless, shaded beneath a crumbling wall, their faces half hidden by scarves. Kara watched them for a moment through the armored glass, noting how none of them waved. None offered any sign of friendliness. She knew that sometimes villagers turned away before fighting began, and their stillness felt like a silent warning. She told herself they were only watching, but the thought did not sit right. The engines roared against the rock as the column pressed on. Dust rose high into the air, pulled into thick plumes by the heavy wheels. The grit found its way through every seam, covering uniforms, weapons, and faces in a fine coat of brown. Kara inhaled and tasted the dryness in the back of her throat. It clung to her teeth and tongue until even water from her canteen felt like sand slipping across stone. She glanced at the gunner above her, the young soldier shifting his weight from one foot to the other while his weapon stayed fixed on the horizon. His jaw was tight. He did not look down at her, but he did not need to. She could feel his tension. The convoy moved past a cluster of abandoned structures, nothing more than shells of stone and crumbling mud walls. Kara kept her eyes on them until the last vehicle cleared the ruins. Shadows hid in every corner, and silence seemed to hang thicker as they passed. A goat herd suddenly scattered on the far side of the road, running up a rocky slope in a storm of dust and hooves. It startled no one but confirmed everything. Animals often sensed what people tried to ignore. Kara leaned back slightly, steady but alert, her eyes never leaving the ridgeline ahead. The quiet was deceptive. A thin skin stretched across something that felt alive and waiting. She let her hand rest on the map again, as if the neat lines and printed names could anchor her in control. The truth pressed harder in her chest. Calm did not mean safe. Calm was only the last breath before violence. She kept her voice level when she spoke into the radio, giving the next check-in. But inside she carried the weight of suspicion. It was too quiet, and she knew quiet was a liar. The blast came without warning. A deep thunderclap ripped through the air as the lead vehicle lifted in a fireball, its front end vanishing in a storm of dust and shrapnel. The explosion punched through Kara's chest like a hammer, and for half a second the world froze. Then, sound returned in a flood. The radio erupted with shouts. The gunner above her screamed contact, and the convoy dissolved into chaos. Another rocket-propelled grenade streaked in from the ridgeline, its smoke trail curling across the burning horizon. It struck the side of a truck 3 vehicles ahead, tearing metal apart and sending bodies flying. Kara's vehicle rocked as shockwaves slammed into it, rattling bolts and armor like a drum under fire. She grabbed the radio handset with one hand and steadied herself with the other, voice cutting through panic. She ordered dismounts to spread, return fire immediately, and maintain spacing. Her words were sharp and clipped, spoken over a roar of engines, gunfire, and screaming voices. Machine guns answered in violent chorus. The metallic hammering of 50 caliber turrets thundered against the canyon walls, echoing back in a rolling storm. Tracer rounds carved bright arcs through the haze, streaking red and green across a sky now filled with smoke and dust. Enemy fire answered, just as fast, rounds slamming into armor, sparking against glass, and chewing into the dirt around them. Soldiers scrambled from doors and hatches, boots hitting the ground as they fired blindly toward the ridges. Kara shouted again, ordering sectors of fire, her throat raw already though the fight had barely begun. Her eyes snapped to the right flank where enemy silhouettes flickered between rocks. She saw muzzle flashes burst like cruel fireworks. She barked coordinates into the radio, demanding gunners shift fire. The response was instant, her turret hammering in the direction she called out, "Tawam." But another blast shook the earth. A rocket slammed into the vehicle on their left, a heavy armored truck now belching flame and black smoke. The screaming over comms tore through the static, broken and desperate. Kara's chest tightened, but her voice did not falter. She ordered fire teams to cover, demanded the medic move forward, and kept her gaze locked on the battlefield unfolding in a blur. Her MRAP rattled under impacts. Small arms fire peppered the hull. The metallic clangs rapid and endless. Dust filtered through the air vents until the cabin felt like a storm of grit. Her gunner shouted down that he was suppressing left, his voice half drowned by the deafening thunder of his weapon. Kara looked down at the handset in her grip, knowing it was her only thread of control. Without it, the convoy would break apart, each soldier drowning in his own small corner of hell. Another radio channel broke in, overlapping, nearly incoherent. Everyone was calling at once, voices layered in panic, some reporting positions, others begging for help, a few screaming in pain. Kara forced her voice higher, sharper, demanding silence until she could give orders. It worked for a moment, just long enough for her to redirect 2 dismounted squads to sweep the rocks on the left while the gunners suppressed the right. The clarity was fragile, but it was enough to keep the convoy from collapsing. She caught sight of a burning MRAP ahead, flames licking out of its hatch, ammunition cooking off inside with sharp pops like fireworks. The soldiers nearby tried to drag their wounded away, ducking and stumbling under fire. The image seared itself into her mind, a symbol of how quickly strength could turn into vulnerability. Her throat ached as she called for them to hold, to keep moving, to fight through it. The radio crackled with acknowledgement, thin voices pushing back against despair. Rockets screamed overhead again. One exploded against the canyon wall, showering the road with chunks of stone. The convoy jerked sideways, trying to push through the kill zone while still returning fire. Kara's vehicle lurched forward, then braked hard as the column stuttered. Every driver torn between survival instinct and training. Dust rose higher with each turn of wheels, turning the road into a choking cloud. Visibility shrank until Kara could barely see the next truck ahead. Only its silhouette outlined in flame and haze. She ordered spacing again, yelling for drivers to push out and avoid bunching. Her voice blended with the storm, yet she refused to let it vanish. Determination beat against panic, word by word. She knew hesitation would mean death for more of them. Her heart hammered, but her hands stayed steady as she keyed the handset and repeated orders like lifelines. The enemy fire did not relent. Their machine guns poured streams of tracers down into the valley, each arc a line of death across the dust-choked sky. Kara forced herself to think past the noise, scanning ridges for patterns, for strong points, for the places where her gunners could concentrate fire. Each decision felt like a gamble with seconds for stakes, yet she acted without pause, her commands carrying through the din. Her own vehicle shuddered as rounds struck its armor in rapid succession. She clenched her teeth, refusing to imagine the steel failing. Sweat stung her eyes. Dust filled her throat. But her mind remained clear. The convoy reeled. Soldiers scrambled, Mayor, and flames burned bright against the desert, but she held the thread of order. In that moment, the fragile connection of her voice across the radio was the only shield they had. She knew the ambush had stripped away certainty. But certainty was never the point. Clarity was, and as long as she gave it, they still had a chance. The gunfire did not stop. It rolled over the convoy in relentless waves, a constant hammering that rattled steel and shook nerves. Enemy fighters pressed close from the ridgelines, firing down with precision, their weapons chewing through rocks and dirt. Every impact felt heavier than the last, as if the desert itself had turned hostile. Kara clutched her radio handset and forced her voice through the static. Her tone was strained but sharp, cutting across channels that were alive with panic. She called out targets, demanded fire sectors, and pushed units into overlapping fields of fire. Each command landed with seconds to spare, her voice weaving a fragile thread of order against the storm. The gunners answered in thunder. 50 caliber turrets roared, sending heavy rounds slamming into the ridges with brutal rhythm. The Mark 19 grenade launcher thumped again and again, its blasts shaking the ground as explosions lit up the rocks. The firepower was immense, but the enemy kept coming. Silhouettes slipped between dust clouds, reappearing where she least expected them. Each burst of muzzle flashed a fresh reminder of how outnumbered they were. The desert closed in. Smoke from burning vehicles mixed with the grit of churned sand until vision shrank to mere shapes in the haze. Kara leaned forward to check her map, but the paper was now smudged and dirty, streaked with sweat and dust. Its neat lines blurred under her hand, and she had to blink hard just to hold the terrain in her mind. She shoved the map back into her lap, knowing order was breaking down even as she fought to hold it together. The radio crackled again, voices layered in confusion. One squad begged for suppression on the right, another shouted about casualties. Kara clenched her jaw, tuned her ear, and forced clarity into chaos. She repeated orders, steadying her words until the noise broke into brief coherence. Her commands directed machine gun fire toward the ridge where muzzle flashes burned brightest, buying a sliver of breathing room for the pinned squads below. The medic sprinted through the dust, crouched low, dragging a wounded soldier by his vest. Kara caught glimpses of them through the haze, bodies jerking under fire, blood streaking into the sand. She ordered suppressive fire to cover their movement, her heart pounding as tracers carved overhead. The medic hauled the man behind a wrecked vehicle, already reaching for bandages while bullets tore into the dirt nearby. Kara shifted her eyes back to her vehicle's gunner. He was firing non-stop, his body vibrating with the recoil of the heavy weapon. Brass casings rained around him, clattering against the roof. She shouted fresh directions, pointing him toward another ridge where enemy shapes flickered in and out of the dust. He swiveled and unleashed another storm of rounds, his face grim and locked in concentration. The ground shook again as another grenade launcher fired. The thump echoed into Kara's bones, followed by the crack of an explosion on the far slope. A brief cheer rose on the radio, quickly cut short by another scream. Kara gripped the handset tighter, her knuckles white, and pushed down the rising tide of exhaustion. She knew her men needed her voice steady. If her tone cracked, so would they. The air was suffocating. Dust filled every breath, every swallow, every blink. Kara's throat burned with it, and her eyes watered until she could barely see. The battlefield felt blind, the horizon erased, the enemy reduced to shadows and flashes. Every command she gave felt like it balanced on guesswork, guided more by instinct than certainty. Still, she gave them, because hesitation was worse than error. Movement meant survival. Her vehicle rattled under another wave of impacts. Rounds pinged against steel and ricocheted off armor plates, the sound a constant reminder that nothing was safe. She ducked instinctively, then forced herself back up, eyes scanning the shifting haze. A dropped helmet lay in the dust outside, lying half buried as if abandoned by the desert itself. She tried not to think about the soldier it once protected. The radio shrieked with overlapping calls again. Kara cut through, her voice louder, angrier, demanding order. She redirected fire teams to shift left, told gunners to rake the ridges with full suppression, and barked for the convoy to maintain its spacing. Her throat felt raw from shouting, but she could not stop. Each command was a lifeline. Each word another thread in the fragile net holding the convoy together. Minutes stretched into hours in her mind. The endless hammer of fire turned time into a blur. Her hands shook, not from fear but from the constant demand to decide, direct, and endure. She looked at the map again, its lines vanishing beneath smears of grime, and felt the weight of responsibility pressing down. If she faltered, the convoy would fracture. If she held, maybe they would live. The smoke thickened, choking the sky. While the gunfire rattled on without pause, Kara pressed the radio against her lips, whispered her next orders, and forced calm into her tone. She was exhausted, afraid, and burning with the strain, but her resolve did not break. Command meant clarity, even in blindness. And as long as her voice reached them through the crackle, they still had a fighting chance. Kara's voice pressed through the static, sharp and urgent. She called for close air support, giving the request with exact coordinates, her words clipped but steady. The radio crackled in reply, confirming that an Apache gunship was inbound. For a moment, silence seemed to expand in her chest, as if relief had already arrived, but she forced herself to stay rigid. Help was coming, but help was never simple. The roar came before the sight. A low thrum grew over the battlefield, deep and heavy, vibrating through the ground and rising into their bones. Soldiers looked skyward through the smoke, searching for the source. Then the shape appeared, black against the burning horizon, rotors spinning in brutal rhythm. The Apache cut through the haze like a predator, descending with a presence that felt larger than life. The rotor wash struck first, whipping sand and dust into walls that consumed the convoy. The storm swallowed sound and sight, leaving only the violent thumping of blades overhead. Kara gripped the radio handset tight in her hand, her knuckles straining white. She gave fresh coordinates, her voice raised above the wind, and prayed that clarity would cut through the storm. The Apache circled once, shadows sliding across wreckage and soldiers alike, hovering like salvation made flesh. The first strike came with terrible beauty. Rockets streaked into the ridge, exploding in fire and stone, tearing enemy positions apart. The blast rolled over the convoy, a wave of heat and dust crashing down. Soldiers cheered despite the ringing in their ears. A sudden burst of morale, rising through exhaustion. Kara allowed herself 1 second to feel it, to let the relief wash through her chest before her eyes hardened again. The fight was far from over. The radio filled with new voices, urgent and overlapping. Ground squads shouted for cover fire, drivers begged for clearance, and the Apache crew demanded target grids. Kara's voice cut into the noise, repeating coordinates with sharp precision. Her words were both command and plea, a thread pulling order from the storm. She knew each mistake carried the risk of friendly fire, and her mind raced faster than her pulse to keep the balance. Every decision felt like balancing on the edge of a blade. The rotor wash grew stronger, tearing grit into their faces, blinding eyes already strained by dust. Soldiers crouched low, trying to shield themselves from the storm, but their weapons stayed fixed on the ridges. The Apache's cannon opened up, its bursts hammering the rocks, sending dirt and debris raining down. Kara shouted into the handset, confirming friendly positions, adjusting fire by meters, her words breaking into the overlapping voices. She could feel the chaos pressing in, the thin line between salvation and disaster tightening around her. Another strike ripped through the far slope. Enemy fighters vanished in a storm of flame, their silhouettes gone in an instant. Soldiers roared in triumph again, but Kara saw the danger hidden within. The kill zone was too close. Some of her men were pinned less than 100 meters from the blast. One wrong angle, one misheard coordinate, and the firepower that saved them could destroy them just as easily. She clenched the handset tighter, her voice raw as she demanded careful spacing and called for fire adjustments. The Apache circled lower, its shadow stretching across the dust like a dark omen. Kara stared at it through the haze, awe and dread twisting together in her chest. It was their savior, but it hovered with power that could crush them as easily as it crushed the enemy. Her heart pounded with each strike, not from fear of failure, but from the knowledge that precision now meant everything. She had to guide the predator, keep its talons sharp and controlled, or risk losing her own to its fury. The radio crackled, voices overlapping in frantic layers. Kara forced herself to be louder, clearer, each command cutting through the storm with clipped certainty. Soldiers adjusted positions, gunners shifted fire, and the Apache responded with devastating force. The battlefield shook with explosions, tracer fire, and the endless thunder of rotors. Relief mingled with dread until the two were indistinguishable. Salvation was here, but salvation was not gentle. It was a blade that had to be wielded with care. The Apache tore into the ridges with savage force. Rockets streaked from its wings and slammed into enemy strongholds, the blasts ripping rock apart in showers of dust and flame. The cannon followed, firing in relentless bursts that shook the air with every impact. Each strike carved deep scars into the battlefield, a display of overwhelming power that left the ground trembling beneath the convoy. For a moment it felt as if the tide had turned, but the relief was fragile. The enemy was close, far closer than Kara wanted them to be. Her squads were pressed against the same ridges being pounded by the gunship. The line between enemy position and friendly ground was razor thin. One wrong call would send fire into her own people. Then it happened. A rocket screamed into the valley wall barely 100 meters from one of her squads. The explosion slammed into the convoy like a giant's fist. Vehicles rattled, soldiers were thrown to the ground, and a shockwave ripped through the haze. Panic broke out on the radio as soldiers shouted over each other. Some yelled that they were hit. Others begged for fire to shift. The voices blended into a rising tide of fear. Kara pressed her headset tight, straining to hear through the chaos. Her gut clenched at the sound of her people screaming in terror, their confidence shattered in an instant. She slammed the transmit button and barked into the radio with every ounce of force she had. Her voice cut like a blade through the noise. She ordered an immediate hold fire, repeating it until the Apache crew acknowledged. The gunship pulled back, but the damage was done. The soldiers had seen how close salvation could come to killing them. The dust swirled thicker, kicked up by rotor wash and the constant churn of battle. Vision collapsed into a storm of brown and black, tracer rounds flashing like sparks in a furnace. Kara's throat burned as she repeated coordinates, shouting them louder each time, as if sheer force could make the pilots understand the exact placement of her troops. She imagined the gunner in the Apache straining to see through the haze, his crosshairs dancing close to her people. The thought filled her with both anger and dread. Her radio erupted again, multiple channels bleeding into each other. One squad begged for cover on the right. Another reported they were almost overrun. The Apache called in, demanding fresh grids before firing again. Kara's mind felt like it was splitting under the weight of competing voices, each pulling her in a different direction. But she could not falter. She forced herself to breathe once, just once, then fired back her commands with clipped certainty. Her voice was iron, even if her body shook. Another near miss rattled the convoy, cannon rounds stitching a line too close to the pinned infantry. Soldiers ducked in terror, some dropping flat against the sand as fragments whistled overhead. Kara could hear their panic, hear it pressing against the edge of discipline. She slammed the radio again, shouting for the Apache to hold fire. Her voice cracked from strain, but it broke through the overlap long enough to halt the next burst. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the low growl of the rotors. Kara felt her hands trembling, the handset slick with sweat. She could not show weakness. Not now. She called out precise grids again, spelling out numbers and landmarks, forcing herself to be slower, clearer, sharper. Every syllable carried the weight of lives. She trusted the crew, but trust had limits. They could not see the ground like she could. They could not hear the screams in her headset or watch the medics drag the wounded through the dust. She was the bridge between salvation and disaster. The battlefield blurred into blindness. Smoke from the burning vehicles mixed with the grit until nothing was visible but flashes of gunfire. The tracer arcs became the only markers of life and death, lines cutting across the storm like guides and threats all at once. Kara tracked them, using their angles to adjust her commands, guiding both her gunners and the Apache. Each correction felt like walking a tightrope above fire. One slip, and everything would collapse. Her chest heaved with exhaustion, but her voice never stopped. She shouted for fire to shift right, then ordered the convoy to expand spacing, then screamed into the handset for the Apache to hold again. The pilots hesitated, asking for confirmation, their words cutting into hers, their insistence clashing with her urgency. She roared over them, her voice raw but commanding, declaring friendlies were too close. The delay stretched into a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. And then the firing ceased. She pressed the handset against her mouth and exhaled, forcing herself to stay steady. The soldiers looked to her, even through the dust and smoke. They could not see her face, but they heard her voice, steady and relentless. That was what mattered. She carried the weight of trust, balancing her duty to protect them with the need to let the gunship strike. Too much caution, and the enemy would break through. Too little, and her own people would burn in friendly fire. It was a balance no commander wanted, but one she carried alone. The Apache circled again, its shadow sweeping over the battlefield like a warning. Kara clenched her teeth, headset pressed tight, eyes on the smudged map in her lap. Her duty was not to trust blindly, nor to control completely, but to steer the chaos into precision. She knew the firepower above was unstoppable, but unstoppable power meant nothing without clarity on the ground. Her clarity. And as long as her voice cut through the storm, they had a chance to survive the knife edge between salvation and destruction. Kara steadied her breathing and keyed the radio again. This time her voice carried less panic and more control, guiding the Apache fire in measured bursts. The pilots adjusted to her cadence, holding back until her orders came through, then unleashing rockets and cannon fire with surgical timing. Each strike cut into the ridgelines with precision, scattering enemy fighters who moments ago had pressed close with confidence. The battlefield still roared, but a thread of order now wove through the storm. The convoy responded to that order. Gunners synchronized with Kara's calls, shifting their heavy weapons in rhythm with the air support. The .50 caliber thunder rolled across the rocks, while grenade launchers thumped steady arcs into enemy clusters. Soldiers moved from vehicle to vehicle under the cover of fire, dragging the wounded to relative safety and laying down bursts to keep the ridges suppressed. Kara heard fewer screams now and more clipped acknowledgments, voices finding coherence after chaos. The crackle of the radio no longer carried only fear, but fragments of coordination. The smoke began to thin as the wind shifted. Through the haze, Kara glimpsed the ridgelines breaking under the combined fire. Positions that had been solid minutes ago were collapsing into rubble. Enemy fighters scrambled, their movements less coordinated, their volleys thinner and scattered. For the first time since the ambush began, the pressure against the convoy lessened. She knew the enemy still fought, but their will was breaking. Victory was not certain, but it was within reach. Kara leaned on her map, smudged and filthy, but still usable. She tracked positions in her head, adjusting calls as if every detail mattered more than her exhaustion. Her throat ached, her body felt heavy, yet her orders remained crisp. She told the convoy to expand its spacing and push forward with discipline. The column began to inch through the valley, slow but determined, no longer a trapped target, but a force reclaiming ground. Dust trailed their movement, but the lines held steady. She watched two soldiers haul a wounded comrade by his vest, the man's rifle still clutched in bloody hands. He refused to let it go even as his strength gave out, a symbol of will that burned into her mind. Others fired from kneeling positions, each burst deliberate, each round part of the larger rhythm. Their resilience matched the thunder from above, human grit reinforced by machine and steel. Kara pressed the handset closer, feeding that rhythm with every word. The Apache strafed the far ridge, its cannon fire cutting a line that silenced the last stronghold. Kara timed the convoy gunners to fire immediately after, overlapping destruction until the slope crumbled. She caught her breath as silence followed, brief but profound. Smoke drifted thin, sunlight piercing through, and she realized the battle was turning. Her people still bled, the ground still burned, but hope had returned. She swallowed hard, pushing her exhaustion aside. Victory was fragile, earned step by step, but she had bent chaos into order, and as long as her voice held, they would survive. The battlefield fell quiet. The last echoes of gunfire faded into the ridges, leaving only the hum of engines idling and the harsh rasp of men and women catching their breath. The Apache circled once more, then banked away toward the horizon. Its rotors thundered into the distance until the sound was gone, replaced by a silence so heavy it pressed into the chest. Kara scanned what was left of her convoy. Vehicles stood scarred and scorched, one burned down to a blackened shell, others dented and smoking from impacts. Soldiers slumped against armor, their weapons loose in exhausted hands. The medic moved quickly among them, binding wounds under the fading light. His face streaked with blood and dust. The ground was littered with shell casings, broken radios, and pieces of gear scattered like fragments of the storm that had just passed. She forced herself to count the wounded and the dead, marking each number with cold precision. Every life weighed on her, but she carried the burden quietly. Her gloves were stained with blood as she set the map across her lap once again, its lines smudged beyond recognition. She wrote her report with steady strokes, even as her hand trembled with fatigue. The sitrep was not for her, but for those who needed proof that order remained, even after the world had fractured. Around her, soldiers leaned against one another in silence. Their eyes were hollow, their faces pale under the grime, yet they looked to Kara whenever she moved. She gave them words of reassurance, brief but certain, and knelt beside the wounded to offer a touch of calm. She hid the exhaustion pressing into her bones, standing tall when her body wanted to collapse. Leadership did not allow collapse. It demanded presence, even in the quiet aftermath. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows over the wreckage. Smoke drifted thin across the valley, the air heavy with the smell of burned metal and dust. Kara lifted her head, staring at the ground they had held, and felt the silence close around her. It was not peace. It was only the pause after survival, the weight of cost settling in. She tasted grit on her tongue, the fine powder left by the rotor wash. Dust clung to her teeth and skin, a reminder that even in victory, the battle did not leave. It stayed with her, etched into every breath.